Imagine being the star of a show. An audience is queued to see you. Tonight you're having an arm amputated. Fully conscious, you scream with pain. That was surgery in Dickensian London. No wonder the world was so desperate for anaesthetics. The brave pioneers of pain control poisoned themselves and their servants in search of the perfect knockout. They blew up operating theatres and lost their minds so that we could have major surgery and not feel a thing. They went in search of oblivion, and this is their story. Before anaesthetics, an evening at an operating theatre was a great night out. Audiences would go to see the blood, smell the wounds, and hear the screams. They could also marvel at the extraordinary speed of surgery. In early 19th century London, surgeons didn't come any faster than the Scottish maverick Robert Liston. Liston performed in small operating theatres open to the public. But he was more than just a sawbones. He was a great surgeon and a great performer who loved playing to the gallery. He never washed his hands before operating. Like most people at the time, he didn't understand the importance of hygiene. But he saved lives. Liston performed operations that other surgeons wouldn't touch. He would carve out tumours, amputate limbs, and slash at gangrenous flesh, all on fully conscious patients.
A man like Robert Liston wouldn't really have considered pain control at all, I don't think. He might have had the odd regret as the patient screamed as the knife went in. But as he did his work, he was really interested in how much he could impress the people who were watching him and how fast he could do his surgery. Could he beat his last time for a certain operation?
Liston had to operate unbelievably fast before the patient was killed by shock from the pain. And that gave him his catchphrase.
Time me, gentlemen! Time me!
From the patient's point of view, it was a whirlwind of black fear that would grip them. They would feel this sense that they had been abandoned into this terrible ordeal from which there was no escape.
Liston would then slice through the flesh, all the way round the limb, saw through the bone and stitch the wound flaps to stop a torrent of blood.
Robert Liston was always very conscious of an amputation being done well. So he forms a flap out of your skin, almost like a dress pattern. The assistant must catch instantly the artery. The artery is tied, and what's left at the end is a padded stump.
As well as this sort of showman style that surrounded Liston, there was undoubtedly huge skill. He couldn't have written the books he wrote. He couldn't have done the operations he performed unless he was a highly skilled surgeon.
Liston was so fast he could remove a limb in just 28 seconds before holding the severed stump up in the air. The audience loved it. But people needing operations weren't quite as keen. Before anaesthesia, patients knew they might die without surgery, but many were so scared they would let their complaints fester until they'd reached record proportions.
Anyone who had a deformity or a growth would basically just have to live with it. Sometimes, to tremendous extremes, there are cases of women who had ovarian cysts that weighed more than they did, and they would have to suffer these rather than have surgery.
One of Liston's patients is reported to have had a tumour on his scrotum so large he had to push it around in a wheelbarrow. But even if a patient agreed to have surgery, that didn't mean they could bear to go through with it on the day. Another of Liston's patients was booked for a bladder stone operation. It was a painful procedure. It involved inserting a rod into the patient's penis and pushing the stone out through a cut made between the legs. Liston's patient was so scared of the bladder stone operation that he threw off the assistants restraining him and locked himself in the loo. Liston strode down the corridor and smashed down the door with his shoulder. He dragged his petrified patient back to the operating table and carried on with the procedure.
Bladder stone operations are quite traumatic because of the region of the body. So the master cutters would do this very quickly. They got it from 45 minutes down to 45 seconds. And it's very high success rate on that.
But the medical establishment hated Liston. Some accounts of his life suggest he perfected his study of anatomy by grave robbing. As soon as Liston qualified in Edinburgh, he started to operate on patients, often judged unsuitable for treatment by other surgeons. Many times he went to their houses to chop off a diseased limb. As one Edinburgh doctor put it,
"Before the days of anaesthetics, a patient was like a criminal awaiting execution. They counted the days, then the hours as they listened for the echo in the street of the surgeon, and watched for the pull of the doorbell, the foot on the stair, and the step into the room, the production of his dreaded instruments, then surrendered their liberty, and, revolting at the necessity, submitted to be held or bound, and helplessly give themselves up to his cruel knife."
Liston's contempt for his colleagues got him barred from the wards in Edinburgh. He moved to London, where he was successful enough to afford a house in Clifford Street, Mayfair. But his abrasive arrogance continued to make him unpopular. And that might explain why his surgical mistakes were so gleefully recorded. Liston's speed with the knife was bad news for one patient expecting to lose his leg. The knife went too far. The patient lost a testicle as well. One of Liston's assistants fared even worse. Whilst holding a patient's leg during an operation, Liston slashed off 2 of his fingers. He later died of septicemia. The patient also died in one of the first operations with a 200% mortality rate. There were pain relief agents around at the time, like willowbark, mandrake and laudanum, but people like Liston had little time for them. If you were lucky, you might get roaring drunk before the operation, but usually the surgeon wouldn't let you. He'd like you to be conscious so he could tell if you were still alive.
Alcohol is not advocated by surgeons at all. It's basically because the blood flow is increased. If you're a surgeon, your worst enemy is the release of artery blood. You need to tie it quickly. Robert Liston is a great user of forceps clamp.
But alcohol and the other pills and potions available couldn't counter such extreme pain. Something more potent needed to be found before Liston would be interested. In 1846, a butler called Churchill was waiting to be brought up to the operating theatre at University College Hospital, London. He was due to have his leg amputated by Robert Liston, the showman surgeon. At the last minute, Liston decided to try out a new substance from America that would change the history of medicine. 8 years earlier, a group of men in the town of Jefferson asked their doctor if he would help them have a good time. He gave them some ether, a medicine used for chest complaints. They inhaled it. They began giggling. They felt lightheaded. They fell over. And most important of all, they didn't feel a thing. The doctor, Crawford Long, saw the bruises, heard that there had been no pain, and made a connection that no one else had spotted. Could this be the answer to the problem of pain in operations? Other medics were coming to the same conclusion as Long. In 1846, in Boston, Massachusetts, the dentist William Morton gave ether as an anaesthetic for the first time. Word soon spread to London about this amazing new substance. The scene was now set for a much more ambitious experiment, and there was one surgeon who was determined to be in charge of it. On the 21st of December, 1846, Robert Liston strode into his operating theatre and announced to his audience,
"We're going to do a Yankee Dutch today, gentlemen. Hold it."
Liston was determined to be the first surgeon in London to use this new anaesthetic. Before administering the ether to his patient, it was tested on a hospital porter. The dosage was wrong and it didn't work. The patient, Frederick Churchill, was now terrified.
It was quite an experiment, in inverted commas, that Liston was performing here. Nobody'd given an anaesthetic much before, so they didn't know how much to give or how long to give it before the surgeon could start, and they hadn't really any idea what the effects of the anaesthetic were going to be.
An eyewitness said that when the ether was put under Churchill's nose, he gurgled and went limp. Liston went to work with his trademark speed. The leg was cut and cauterized in an extraordinary 28 seconds. But he needn't have rushed. The only noise from his patient was deep breathing. At the end, Liston nodded to his assistant to remove the ether. The butler's next words changed the course of medical history.
When are we going to begin?
The day after Churchill's operation, a London newspaper proclaimed, "We have conquered pain." Liston understood immediately the significance of what had happened. He wrote to a friend, "It is a great matter to be able to destroy sensibility to such an extent and without apparently any bad results." Liston's enthusiasm for anaesthetics was soon matched by some solid thinking. Another doctor, John Snow, began to turn pain control into a science. Snow produced tables showing the correct amounts of ether to be given. He also invented new, more convenient inhalers for patients. Liston's charisma and Snow's advances turned the discovery of anaesthetics into a public sensation. People who'd been too frightened to have an operation because of the pain began to come forward. And whole new types of surgery became possible. Before anaesthetics were available, it was almost impossible to operate on the stomach.
The intestines were all pushing against you the whole time and might even come right outside the human body. Once that had happened, it was very hard to get them back in again because of this tension in the muscles. So the surgeons would fight for hours pushing things back in and trying to stitch you up again. Once you had anaesthesia, the muscles became more and more relaxed. So at a certain point, you could stitch them up very, very easily. And this revolutionized surgery.
Which meant good news for patients, but bad news for Robert Liston's audiences. It was now no longer necessary to operate at lightning speed. You could take your time. The sense of relief was summed up by Lady Paget, wife of the chief surgeon of St Bart's Hospital in London. She launched a campaign for Anaesthetics Day, a national holiday to celebrate the day pain was conquered. It was so important to her because she lived next to the operating theatres and was disturbed by the constant sound of people's screams. But with the euphoria building, the shortcomings of ether started to become clear. It made patients throw up their entire stomach contents and was also mildly explosive. Many of the operations conducted in front of the roaring fires of consulting rooms had disastrous results. The use of a face mask was also a problem. It made surgery on the jaw difficult. It was uncomfortable for some patients. To solve that, doctors later learned to administer ether into the other end of the patient. Ether's many drawbacks meant the search was on to find an alternative. It came in the form of a substance pioneered by a teenage chemist called Humphrey Davy.
As you start to breathe it, you get more and more euphoric. You become more and more disinhibited, so your behavior, instead of being calm and measured, suddenly starts to become more and more outlandish.
Davy heated ammonium nitrate and, like any good anaesthetics inventor, tested the effects on himself. In 1799, he had himself shut in an airtight box. Then his new substance was blown in. Davy described the experience.
My sensations were pleasant, a disposition to muscular exertion and merriment. Trains of vivid images passed through my mind and were connected with words in such a manner as to produce perceptions perfectly novel.
Davy had created nitrous oxide, which he christened laughing gas. It would transform a visit to the dentist and pave the way for dental surgeries. But no one realized that when it was first discovered.
They'd found perhaps the most exciting thing they were ever going to discover, which was a way of producing painless surgery. And what did he do about it? Absolutely nothing. He kept it with his friends, breathed it, used it as a recreational drug. They had great parties with it.
The medical profession ignored nitrous oxide for the next 30 years, but the travelling showman loved it. Public displays of laughing gas became a regular at fun fairs. This description dates from 1844.
12 young men have volunteered to inhale the gas to commence the entertainment. The gas will be administered only to gentlemen of the first respectability. The object is to make the entertainment in every respect a genteel affair.
These performances involving young men hallucinating dangerously were well known. And once doctors started buzzing about the discovery of ether, they realised laughing gas might also be used as an anaesthetic. Having a tooth removed was a common and painful operation at the time. American dentist Horace Wells believed so passionately in this new substance that he had one of his own healthy teeth taken out under nitrous oxide to show it didn't hurt. Then he decided to demonstrate to the rest of his profession.
Unfortunately, it didn't go very well for Wells because having put the patient seemingly asleep, he pulled on the tooth to be extracted and the patient shouted. And so Wells was booed and hissed and left the room in disgrace. But Wells knew that it worked because it had worked for him and it was working for other patients.
Laughing gas changed dentistry forever and was particularly appreciated in the days before fluoride toothpaste and 6 monthly checkups. But nitrous oxide still wasn't the perfect anaesthetic. It was too weak to knock the patient out. There had to be something better, and celebrity sawbones Robert Liston was determined to find it. Liston had performed the first surgery under anaesthetic in Europe in December 1846. He spent that Christmas at home in London with Dr. James Simpson, an old friend from Edinburgh who had also caught the anaesthetics bug.
Simpson was fired up with enthusiasm about ether. He immediately rushed back to Edinburgh to try it on his own patients in childbirth. He at once recognised that ether did have some drawbacks. He wanted to look for something with all the advantages of ether, but none of the disadvantages, and that was what he set out to do.
Try this one first.
Simpson went in search of any substance that would vaporise. He wanted to know which ones would send you off to sleep if inhaled. Over the next few months, Simpson and his assistant inhaled acetone, benzene, chloride of hydrocarbon, and dozens of other chemicals in search of something that would knock him out.
As you can imagine, this had a very bad effect on him. Frequently, he found himself so hoarse in his throat that he couldn't lecture the next day. He was sometimes laid up in bed and ill for quite a while after the experiments. His family were clearly quite upset about it, but nothing was ever going to dissuade him from carrying on.
On the 4th of November 1847, as Simpson groggily worked his way through the shelves of the local pharmacy, he eventually found a solvent called chloroform. It was good. Very good. Simpson was found unconscious on the floor. When he came round, he didn't remember a thing.
Simpson, in his life as an obstetrician, had seen many complicated births and labours. I mean, because of poor nutrition in those days, many women had deformed pelvises and they suffered horrendously, and very often the child died and there was a high mortality rate amongst the mothers too. He had seen enormous suffering. He was quite sensitive to the suffering of his patients and he wanted to alleviate it.
Simpson was determined to bring some relief to this process and put some fizz into his social life at the same time. He set up a dinner party for the cream of Edinburgh society. Once the plates were cleared away, Simpson's guests were each given a glass of fizzy water mixed with chloroform.
1, 2, 3, down!
Simpson became so merry, he's reported to have stood on his head. Other guests fancied themselves as angels or broke out in uncontrollable laughter. The party decided the stuff was so potent they wanted it taken away.
Well, those guests who were given the chloroform champagne described it as heady. I imagine that they were feeling distinctly lightheaded, intoxicated, possibly maybe a little aroused, one feels, because it did have this slight aphrodisiac effect. Anyway, it wasn't the kind of thing you needed at a Victorian dinner table.
Below stairs, the cook decided to try this exciting beverage herself. She too passed out. Simpson was now convinced this was the stuff to give to pregnant women. But his plan to give women pain relief during childbirth hit an unexpected obstacle.
There was one clergyman in particular who said that chloroform was a decoy of Satan designed to rob God of the deep, earnest cries that arise in times of trouble.
Simpson fought back against the religious objections. He published his own pamphlets and produced articles arguing that if you're going to condemn chloroform on biblical grounds, you could argue that travelling in a carriage or wearing a hat also goes against God's will. But it wasn't just the church that was against chloroform.
Doctors opposed chloroform for a variety of reasons. Some of them said quite rightly, we just don't know what it does to the human body. And then, of course, there was Dr. Green, who said that it caused erotic dreams. He actually said that one woman had offered to kiss the male attendant while she was giving birth. This was something he found personally revolting and thought that women would rather die than have this happen to them. He also said that women under the influence of chloroform uttered coarse language, in itself sufficient reason that it should never be given to English women.
The tide of public opinion began to shift as two celebrity mothers opted for a chloroform birth. Kate Dickens, the wife of Charles, was about to give birth to her 8th child. Dickens had met Simpson and been enthused about chloroform. Then, in 1849, when Kate gave birth to Henry Fielding Dickens, she did so with the assistance of chloroform. Afterwards, Dickens wrote that the shock to his wife's nervous system was reduced to nothing, and she was, to all intents and purposes, well the next day. Dickens' writings widened interest in chloroform. Then, in 1853, the most famous celebrity mother imaginable joined the cause. Queen Victoria was pregnant with Prince Leopold. She'd already experienced 7 agonizing deliveries and had decided that pain in childbirth was not a divinely appointed gift, whatever the men of the church said.
I think Queen Victoria opted for a chloroform birth for the same reason as any woman would do. She found the birth experience extremely painful, and she'd heard good things about chloroform. And certainly, for the 2 previous births, she'd made inquiries about it, but it had never quite got to the stage of actually agreeing to. And then for the birth of Prince Leopold, they asked Dr. Snow to come to court, and he put on his best hat and his sword, and off he went.
Queen Victoria became a great fan of chloroform, with some startling consequences.
When her eldest daughter Vicky was about to give birth, she sent her a bottle of chloroform. Vicky's labour was lengthy and complicated. It was believed that both she and the baby would die. Fortunately, a doctor arrived who knew how to use chloroform. Vicky inhaled it, and he was able to turn the baby, which was in a breech position, to enable it to be born normally. The baby looked dead. He applied artificial respiration, and at last it took its first breath, and it survived. That child was the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, who led Germany into the First World War.
Simpson eventually won his battle, and chloroform became a mainstay of anaesthetics for childbirth and other operations. His opponents were gracious in defeat. After his death, a memorial honouring Simpson's work was erected in Westminster Abbey. After 2 years of intense excitement, the world had gone from having no anaesthetics to having 3 of them: ether, laughing gas and chloroform. And the search was still on for the perfect knockout substance with no side effects. But this didn't mean the end of pain in operations. One senior doctor who was surrounded by the traumatized young men shot up in the Crimean War decided that pain relief was unmanly. He tried to ban anaesthetics. In 1854, Britain and Russia went to war in the Crimea. It was the most severe winter in living memory. Dr. John Hall was appointed the Chief of Medical Staff. He had his own views about newfangled anaesthetics.
The smart use of the knife is a powerful stimulant. It is much better to hear a man bawl lustily than to see him sink quietly into his grave.
Hall believed that soldiers about to be operated on should be given a bullet or a leather belt to bite on, not chloroform.
John Hall had become the chief medical officer in the army. He'd been promoted up through the ranks. He had little experience of modern surgery and anaesthesia. He only knew what he had read in the journals and from anecdotal references that chloroform could be dangerous. As an army doctor, he expected the soldiers to be brave and withstand pain without the aid of anaesthesia.
Hall's edict split the medical establishment. Even the patients weren't sure if they wanted anaesthetizing.
The average soldier was illiterate, but they were brave men, and they were afraid of this new anaesthesia because they thought as they were going to sleep, they would give away their life secrets.
There was something in John Hall's view. In states of extreme shock, such as when soldiers had had limbs blown off on the battlefield, a mix of adrenaline and endorphins would often stave off the pain. But the effect would wear off and the soldiers would be in a desperate state by the time they reached the field hospital. The majority of surgeons ignored their commander's instructions and used chloroform.
The doctors in the Crimea did not follow John Hall's instructions. Most of them had been trained in Scotland or Ireland. They knew the benefits of chloroform. They did not want to see men screaming and crying with pain when they knew they had chloroform. Not only that, they were able to take a little longer with the operations. They were able to stop the bleeding, and therefore the men would be more likely to survive.
But whilst it was good in battlefield situations, chloroform wasn't the perfect knockout drug. The first patient to make that clear was 15-year-old Hannah Greener. In January 1848, Hannah was about to have an operation to remove an ingrowing toenail. The doctor decided to use chloroform. It was a fatal decision. After going under, Hannah turned pale. They tried to revive her by giving her tots of brandy and opening the window. But Hannah had died, the first recorded fatality of chloroform.
I think Hannah Greener died because she was so nervous. The nervousness created a lot of adrenaline in her body. That combined with the chloroform to cause a dysrhythmia in her heart, and because she had that dysrhythmia, the heart stopped.
Until the 1860s, the problem with anaesthetics was that they knocked the whole patient out. Sometimes doctors just wanted to knock part of the patient out. The equipment needed to do this effectively was invented in France in the mid-19th century. The issue was, what do you put in the syringe? There was one substance, distilled from the coca plant, that was known to have medicinal properties. In 1860, Albert Nyman purified this strange compound. He called it cocaine. It became the world's first effective local anaesthetic. One doctor was so enthused by cocaine, he used it to conduct an operation on himself.
This has to be one of the most extraordinary pictures of all time. Here is a surgeon who has not only put in his own spinal anaesthetic by pushing a needle through his back into his cerebrospinal fluid, he's then administered cocaine into that fluid, removed the needle, gone numb from the waist down, and is now sitting there repairing his own hernia. The two stalwarts on either side were there to give him encouragement, to help him, and occasionally to give him a bit of a shake or slap him around the face, because every now and then he'd pull a bit hard on what he was operating on and he might faint from various reflexes, and so he had to be brought round again before he could continue with the procedure.
The doctors who embraced cocaine tested it on themselves with more and more enthusiasm. And that became a problem. Many of the hastily published research papers from the time are incoherent, nonsensical, and incomplete. Cocaine turned many of its early proponents into drivelling basket cases, many of whom then died, which didn't help the research process. But the search did begin for a non-addictive form of cocaine. It ended in 1905 with a derivative of cocaine called Novacaine. For decades afterwards, it helped people cope with a regular but unpleasant experience. The realization that cocoa leaves could be turned into a powerful drug made some researchers look towards another drug made from a plant. They knew all about it from accounts from explorers, but they didn't know which plant it came from. And the people who did were in a different continent. The Amazonian Indians had paralyzing arrows loaded with a homemade drug called curare that they used to hunt animals. A 19th century explorer had brought samples of curare back to London and found it had unusual properties.
What happens is it circulates around in the bloodstream and blocks the transmission of impulses between nerves and muscles. And so the muscles, not getting that nervous transmission, relax completely.
But the only way to find the secret of this thick black substance was to travel to the Amazon jungle and ask the people there how they made it. That project was undertaken by Richard Gill, a medical school dropout with a love of adventure but progressive paralysis of the muscles. In 1938, Gill decided he would go into the jungle and bring back the secret of curare. For 5 months he lived among the local people, seeking out and preparing the plants they used to make the drug. Gill discovered a lot about jungle medicine from his new friends, partly because he was so ill while he was out there. But his mission was accomplished. He returned with 25 pounds of curare and the information that it was made from a plant called Condidendron tomentosum. When Gill brought the plant back to London, none of the drug companies were interested. Gill died in 1958, but by this time curare had become widely accepted by the medical world and was an essential part of 20th century anaesthetics. It had a unique effect.
What happens is profound muscle relaxation. So you're not giving so much poison to the patient with all the inhalational agents, and you can run a very light anaesthetic with the patient unconscious. This allows the surgeon entry into the body cavities.
By the 1930s, it was clear that anaesthetics were getting more and more sophisticated. But the people in charge of giving them weren't. Before professional associations existed, anyone in the operating theatre was allowed to control the flow of chemicals to a patient. As one professor put it, anaesthetists are at the bottom of the professional hierarchy, with a high proportion of dimwits, no-hopers and drunks. Something had to be done.
There were undoubtedly calamities that took place because anaesthesia wasn't of a high standard or of the same high standard across the country.
So the so-called dimwits, no-hopers and drunks got together and decided to set exams for their profession and established the Association of Anaesthetists of Great Britain and Ireland. They needed to do it, they said, because of all the developments in their specialty. One of the most scary was intubation, putting a tube down the patient's throat so a machine could make them breathe while they were unconscious. If the anaesthetist put the tube into the gullet instead of the windpipe, it could kill the patient. Other developments kept anaesthetists on their toes. New ways of knocking people out, monitoring them while they were out, bringing them back and keeping their bodies functioning. It put massive responsibilities on the knockout doctors, who spend their day taking patients as close to death as possible.
When you're dealing with somebody's life being held in your hand, then you have to concentrate every second on what's going on. You have to watch every heartbeat, you have to watch every breath, balancing the drugs that are being given, the pain relief, the sedation, the muscle relaxants, getting everything just right, taking over the normal functions of the patient, keeping them safe, and then bringing them back again afterwards.
Other drugs emerged with new properties. Halothane could knock you out in 2 minutes, rather than the usual 5 to 10. New ways of administering anaesthetics were also discovered. One of the most significant was demonstrated in the dunked dog experiment.
This extraordinary picture shows a dog upside down in a tank of water under an anaesthetic. And what this demonstrated was that you can have truly closed-circuit anaesthesia with a cuff inflated, not even being underwater would allow anything to pass down into the lungs of the animal or the patient unless it was delivered through that anaesthetic delivery system.
The dunked dog experiment meant that for the first time a machine could effectively breathe for the patient. The next big sensation in anaesthetics arrived in 1964. A drug that could be carried in a bottle and instantly injected into a patient after an accident. It was ketamine, a drug derived from phencyclidine, better known as PCP. Phencyclidine had been around since the 1950s and, as well as its anaesthetic properties, was known to have other effects. The minor drawbacks included twitching, retching, vomiting, spasms of the throat and tremors. The most serious drawback was the tendency of patients to become delusional, leading to bizarre, violent and self-destructive behavior. In their search for a derivative drug without the side effects, chemists came up with ketamine. But who could they test it on?
Once ketamine had been isolated by a drug company, they did a clinical trial on inmates of a prison in America.
Despite the questionable ethics of testing drugs on prisoners, ketamine was pronounced safe enough for general use and quickly hit the market, targeted particularly at children and the elderly. But the problem of delusions hadn't gone away. Ketamine could give patients terrible hallucinations. One 11-year-old boy woke up screaming. He was convinced the grandmother he'd tested was at his bedside. For the next 5 days, he continued to hallucinate. Too afraid to come out from under his blankets, the boy was convinced the ceiling would fall on him and was haunted by images of terrifying creatures. Despite its extreme side effects, it was still thought to be an ideal anaesthetic for kids.
The suspicions about hallucinations on emergence, I've heard colleagues say to me, well, that doesn't matter quite so much in children because they live in a dreamlike state when they're very young anyway. And if you're not able to talk very much about the experience because you're so young, you can't tell people what it was really like anyway.
Ketamine is still used in emergencies, but with sedatives to combat its side effects. It's now better known as a street drug used by clubbers, called Special K. After 150 years of experimentation, the search for the perfect anaesthetic has ended. That's because it doesn't exist. It's now recognized that knocking a patient out, keeping them functioning and bringing them back smoothly requires a cocktail of substances that vary for each individual. John Golston is a consultant anaesthetist at the Middlesex, now a sister hospital to UCH, where Victorian maverick Robert Liston worked as a surgeon. John's first patient today is Ron Large, who's about to have a general anaesthetic. Dr. Golston has to assess the exact amount Ron should be given. Too little and he might wake up. Too much and he might never come round.
When was your first anaesthetic? How long ago was it?
My tonsils, when I was during the war years.
Right.
Yeah,
so things have changed a bit.
T-strainer over you.
Yeah, things have changed a lot.
Oh yes,
since then.
Certainly have.
Now there are over 100 drugs used in anaesthesia and a monitor to measure every function.
I'll just ask you to take a couple of breaths in and out there.
Ron is injected with the anaesthetic.
Very good. Are you feeling sleepy yet?
No.
Nothing happening. Right, this is where we use the hypnosis now.
And within 30 seconds, he's unconscious and taken off for surgery.
There we go. And we'll just get him into theatre.
But the anaesthetist's job doesn't stop there. They need to administer anaesthetic throughout the operation, monitor the patient, and be on hand in case anything goes wrong.
When things go wrong in the operating theatre, they go wrong when patients are very sick. And when things start to go wrong, they go wrong quickly, and you need to step in and deal with that.
One of the anaesthetist's worst nightmares is someone waking up during an operation.
Some sort of recollection of what's happened during theatre might be 1 in 1,000. Those numbers of people who do wake up during surgery completely awake but paralysed are thankfully a very small group of people.
3 years ago, Maxine Malloy went into hospital to have a lump in her breast removed. It was an experience that she'll never forget.
The anaesthetist was very calm, very reassuring. He gave me the anaesthetic. I went off to sleep. And the next thing I remember is waking up and becoming conscious of things in my throat. And then I thought, oh my God, this is my surgery. I'm on the operating table, and the reason I can't breathe is because they're breathing for me. The things in my throat are the breathing tubes. I could hear voices. I didn't know what they were saying. And I just kept thinking, I must make them see I'm awake. I must make them see I'm awake. I'm going to feel them cut me. And I just couldn't cope with that. And then I did feel a sharp, penetrating, terrible pain in my right breast where the tumour was. And I panicked and thought, oh my God, this is terrible, this is terrible. And I must have passed out then, or the anaesthetic started to work, because the next thing I remember is waking up in the corridor outside the operating theatre as they wheeled me back to the recovery room. And I sat up immediately, much to their surprise, I think, and started to shout, I was awake, I was awake.
The muscle relaxants Maxine had been given had paralysed her, but unusually she was resistant to the anaesthetic.
To be conscious on the operating table and to feel them cut you was the most terrifying experience I've ever had. It is your worst nightmare, you know, being helpless, literally helpless and paralysed, and feeling pain and knowing you can do nothing about it, and it's just awful.
Despite her ordeal, Maxine decided not to take legal action and to look on the positive side.
I feel as though I've faced my worst fear, as I've faced death. And when you faced that and survived, you haven't got anything left to be afraid of.
The Middlesex has equipment that monitors brainwaves to prevent cases like Maxine's from happening. But not all hospitals have this new technology.
I've been practicing medicine now for 20 so years, and I haven't had anyone, I must say, who's reported to me that they've been conscious during an operation.
But the stress of taking patients so close to death does take its toll.
One of the downsides of anaesthesia for anaesthetists may be the high suicide rate that is apparent in our profession. To get exact figures is very difficult, but figures up to 10% in a lifetime risk has been quoted and has been partly verified. So it would appear that in my lifetime I have a 10% risk of killing myself because of the stress that I'm under doing the job I'm doing.
The stress anaesthetists suffer doesn't just come from working in the operating theatre. When there's a major disaster, they're often the first medics on the scene. John Golston was the anaesthetist in charge of casualty on the day of the Ladbroke Grove train crash. More than 30 people died and many were seriously injured when two trains collided outside London in October 1999.
The type of scene that you might see might be quite devastating and quite shocking, even to doctors who have worked for many years. But the essential thing is to identify patients who can survive and to treat them quickly. The scene can often be extremely chaotic, but your job is entirely focused about keeping somebody alive whilst they're being removed from the scene.
Once in hospital, a full range of modern-day anaesthetics can be deployed. The drugs are now so advanced that you can have many operations whilst remaining fully conscious and still not feel a thing. Silvana McCluskey is about to have her baby delivered by caesarean section, as it's too big for a natural birth. It's a complicated procedure, as the anaesthetist must protect both Silvana and her unborn child. The anaesthetist in charge is Dr. Wynne Davis. He's going to give Silvana a spinal block. That's an injection in the back that should stop her feeling any pain.
Okay, it stings a little bit. It's like a little bee sting. Here it comes. So there's a little bit of sticky tape. You can sit yourself up. Your legs will feel slightly strange.
Within seconds of being given the spinal block, Silvana has lost all sensation from the waist down. As soon as the anaesthetic has taken hold, the surgeon puts on his favourite music and the operation begins. One of the most striking ways anaesthetics has changed is that now most patients are conscious during surgery. In the past, the anaesthetist's job was to knock the patient out, but now they also have to be good communicators. And less than 20 minutes since the operation started, Silvana gives birth to a 9-pound, 2-ounce baby girl.
Hello, baby girl. This is my
Husband Kevin is overjoyed as almost immediately after the operation, Silvana is united with her daughter. So in 150 years, we've gone from having operations with patients awake and screaming in agony to operations with patients awake who can't feel a thing. Anaesthesia has now become so advanced that even major surgery can be done with just a half-day's stay in hospital. It's quite a leap since Robert Liston, the showman surgeon, was amputating limbs on this table that's kept at Middlesex Hospital. Does this mean we're now taking anaesthetics for granted? Well, the people whose blood has been caked into the grain of this table would probably say that we do.